name is Catherine Mattice, and yeah, I'm the founder and CEO of Civility Partners. And I'll talk a little bit about my own fortitude here and how I got into the world of workplace bullying, which is my very special niche topic. I was a director of human resources for an organization where another director, so my peer, was a bully, essentially. And he, micromanaged people. He yelled. He made it very clear if he did not like you versus if he did like you. He was frustrating. I was one of his targets. So I experienced being bullied at work as a target. And being in HR, I was the one receiving all of the complaints about his behavior. I was the one dealing with the turnover in his department. And so I really saw firsthand how damaging workplace bullying is for both targets and organizations. I saw, the damage and the pain that it caused. While I was working there, I started getting my master's degree in organizational communication and ended up doing all of my graduate research on the topic of bullying at work. And so I joke, I have a master's degree in workplace bullying. So if you want to know how to do it really well, see me after and I'll give you some tips. Fast forward all these years later, Civility Partners is on its 15th year anniversary, and we really focus on creating positive, thriving, and respectful work cultures. We do that through workforce surveys, helping the organization figure out what to do with that data and make change. Of course, we do lots of training programs. And I specialize in coaching for leaders accused of being too abrasive, creating a hostile work environment, and so on. And I have served a huge array of clients over the years. And as was mentioned, I have had the fortunate opportunity of being cited in a lot of really, really cool places. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in and talk about workplace bullying. So I'd love to see in the chat, what does toxic behavior mean to you? When you think about toxic behavior at work, what does that word toxic mean? I'd love to see some messages. Isolating, pushy, favoritism, withholding information, dismissive, being disrespectful. Yeah, so thank you. And I want to call your attention to the fact that toxic behavior is or can be fairly subtle, right? Being dismissive or disrespectful is toxic. It doesn't have to be some horrible, egregious, overt harassment scenario for us to say something is toxic. So being rude or gossiping or sarcastic at somebody's expense or playing favorites, that's all toxic behavior. And that's really the message that Civility Partners focuses everything on, that in something like harassment prevention training, for example, which I'm in California, we're required to do it every couple of years. It's so focused on the compliance and the horrible, egregious harassment behaviors. But toxic behavior is really anything that leaves others feeling excluded instead of included. So I always talk about bad behavior or toxic behavior on a scale. At one end, we have things like incivility, microaggressions, unresolved conflict or ugly conflict. Of course, conflict can be good too, but we all know there's an ugly version of conflict. And if that behavior and the types of behaviors that you all suggested, being rude, disrespectful, competing, being dismissive, playing favorites, isolating others, if that type of behavior is allowed to go on and the organization is not addressing that type of behavior, then it escalates into abusive conduct or workplace bullying. This is where I really differ from the law and how the law defines things. So bullying and harassment, question I get a lot, what's the difference between the two? The answer is there isn't a difference. Harassment and bullying are the same exact behaviors. So harassment is a category of abusive conduct or bullying. Bullying is any type of behavior that is, leaving people feeling isolated. It's aggressive communication, it's manipulation, it's humiliation. And if you aim those behaviors at a particular race, gender, nationality, disability, then we call it harassment. and that's unlawful behavior. So if you're an equal opportunity harasser, that's bullying. And unfortunately, that is lawful behavior. Another category of bullying is group bullying. So things like hazing or mobbing. And then at the other end of the spectrum is violence. So again, if incivility is allowed to go on, it can escalate into abusive conduct or harassment or hazing. And if that behavior is allowed to go on, it can certainly escalate into workplace violence. Now, I coach individuals who've been accused of, harassing or creating a hostile work environment. Just to give you an example of how this behavior crosses over, one individual I coached, people described that he would rise up out of his chair and really lean right over across his desk in your face. And people really described this very aggressive facial expression, eyes popping out, vein bulging, the shoulders puffed up. So there's this real aggression that came in the nonverbal communication. That's workplace violence. It doesn't have to be punching someone. That counts as workplace violence. All that has to happen is for the person on the other side to feel fear for their safety. So bullying and violence can absolutely cross over. Just to highlight my point about the difference between harassment and bullying, harassment is a form of employment discrimination, and it's conduct unwelcome based on race, religion, sex, nationality, and a nice long list of protected characteristics. It's unlawful when enduring the conduct is a condition of employment or so severe or pervasive a reasonable person would consider it intimidating, hostile, or abusive. Everything in that white box, everything in where it says harassment becomes unlawful. Those two things also define workplace bullying. So again, harassment and bullying are the same thing. This is an important message for organizations to hear. Organizations need to understand that we got to stop drawing a line between harassment and bullying, or harassment and an anti-harassment initiative and a DEI initiative. These things work together. The other thing I want to point out is that toxic behavior is a social thing. So you have the toxic individual, the person engaging in toxic behavior, and their target or targets. What you also have are counselors. These are people who support the target. These are people who provide ad hoc counseling, essentially. So if you've ever been bullied at work or mistreated at work, you probably had a friend, somebody that you spoke to at work about it. You go to their office and spend some time complaining or getting advice. So that person would be your counselor. The toxic individual also has counselors. So they're also complaining about the target. And the target is, or the person engaging in the toxic behavior is complaining about the target and what they're lacking performance or blah, blah, blah. Then the toxic individual often has advocates and allies. So the narrative that I see a lot in my sales process is that the human resources professional has been trying to get the CEO to address the behavior, much like I was when I was internal. And the CEO is saying, they're a really high performer. Leave them alone. They bring results. So there's some reason that this individual is being supported and allowed to act this way. I see that there is a question. I will grab it in 1 second. So the advocates and allies for the toxic individual are the CEO and the leadership team who's allowed this person to behave that way because they're a high performer, because they bring results. So that's an unfortunate situation where the person being supported by the organization is the toxic individual because they bring results. I understand we have a question. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask it, or type it in the chat, and I will be happy to answer it.
Just quickly, the toxic behavior directed because of sex, race, religion, whatever. What if it's just simply to dominate and force other people into their plan? I think you're saying that if it's race, religion, gender, those kinds of things, that it's legally actionable.
Mhm.
Which makes you feel like if they're claiming that they're doing this behavior for their own benefit, is really what you call it. They're doing it just for their own benefit. Is that actionable?
Unfortunately not. And that's the problem with the laws in the United States, is that while a person being discriminated against because of their gender, let's say, um, they're receiving the same types of behaviors. They're being isolated, they're being manipulated, they're being shut out. They may be at the receiving end of aggressive behavior. All of that is unlawful, because if the person at the receiving end can say, well, I'm the only woman here and I'm the only one being treated this way, then it's harassment. The law says that's against this woman's civil rights. She has the right to be treated fairly at work. But if somebody is just treating everybody that way, their whole team is treated with disrespect, they're at the receiving end of, manipulation and aggression and humiliation. If you aim that behavior at everyone, then it is not actionable, unfortunately. And that's a problem that I have with the laws in the United States. There's actually a ton of other countries who do have laws against workplace bullying. So we're actually pretty far behind many other countries. Does that answer your question?
It does. And it's kind of scary that they really can get away with it legally. I mean, at least if it's based on your gender or your race or those kinds of things, you can take legal action. But the rest of us, if we can't, there's probably some subtle aspect of, that kind of racial or gender discrimination going on. But if you can't establish that, it sounds like we're stuck tolerating that kind of thing. So we have to develop some kind of our own personal defense to it.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's chronic, I can't control another person.
Right.
And so that's like beyond my job description or my responsibility to address that kind of thing. I do need to stand up for myself. I do need to set boundaries with the person, that kind of thing. But that's doesn't often have much effect, really, I've seen. So
Yeah. Thank you for those comments. Yeah. So that's why civility partners exist. And that's, we do a lot of work beyond the topic of bullying these days. But when I first started out of graduate school, I wrote that book back off pretty quickly right out of graduate school. And I'm in the process of actually writing a version 2 because it's so old. But that book is essentially how to work your way through the politics of an organization if you feel bullied. And there's this whole section and chapter on all the things that you need to bring to HR to get HR to pay attention to you. Because if you're not saying, if you go to HR and say, I'm being harassed because I'm a woman or because of my race or because of my sexual orientation, any of those characteristics, then HR, the sirens go off and HR does an investigation and there's a whole thing. But if I say, gosh, my boss just treats us all like crap and makes it difficult to get anything done, then yells at all of us, a lot of HR folks out there are going to say, well, unfortunately, that's not unlawful. And also they'll often say, unfortunately, the CEO is okay with all of that because this person is a high performer. And that's why this whole thing about the social, that this is a social phenomenon, that we often get really focused on the villain, this person's toxic, they're a horrible person. I'm going to talk to you about why they act this way. But we need the people around us to help stand up for us, and we need to be able to stand up for ourselves. The research does find that as soon as the moment someone comes after you, if you push back on them, and it may take a couple of times, they will leave you alone. So that's one thing, is that y'all have to be on heightened alert of, somebody pushing your buttons in some way to immediately step up for yourself when it's easier, because, 2 years from now, if they're still picking on you, it's a lot harder to get them to stop.
Oh, I see. If you do it quickly, you stand a
Yep.
better chance
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
if I just stay in shock mode and numbness mode that they're carrying on this way. So standing up
Yeah.
because they're looking for a fight anyway. If you give it to them, then they have respect for you, kind of thing. King of the Hill.
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly right. Then they respect that you're not going to allow them to push on you. So they're essentially going to push on everyone, and then they'll push on the people that allow it by not speaking up. Everybody likes the path of least resistance. So,
So they're just they're doing that
mhm. Yeah,
thing where they're just bullying and out of control. They'll bully until they can't, where they can.
exactly. Yeah. So what organizations need to be focused on doing is turning reinforcers into upstanders. So reinforcers, look where they sit. They're on the toxic person's side by not saying anything. So a message that I always want to put out there is, as scary as it is, if you're observing bad behavior, be it a microaggression or a serial interrupter or somebody who's, making jokes at someone else's expense, all the way up to bullying and harassment and this more egregious overt behavior, that we want to step in. Because if you don't step in, if you stay silent, that makes you a reinforcer. Your messaging to the toxic individual is, I'm okay with that behavior. I'm not going to call it out. And
True.
of course, go ahead.
It makes it seem like it's a gang as opposed to just the one person. Now there's a whole gang now, on
Yeah.
person, which makes it feel like they are not going to accept you standing up or setting boundaries with them.
Right. So if a whole group of people are being advocates and allies for the target, then again, we like the path of least resistance. We're not going to continue to bully if there's social pressure not to. And so there's so many facets to this whole process. And we do get so focused on the villain, but really it's up to the organization, for example, to say, we don't tolerate behavior like that. We don't care if you're a high performer. You can't act that way. We care about the way people are treated here. And we expect and will give you resources, hey, workforce, to stand up for yourselves and each other, because we want you all to be keepers of the culture. And so, the organization has a lot to play a role in this. For example, there's a ton of research that there's things happening in an organization that actually facilitate the opportunity for discrimination, harassment, and bullying to occur. So, for example, a lack of diversity, the one underrepresented person or group there's more likelihood that they would be mistreated if there's a lack of diversity in the organization. If an organization values results over behavior, which is what I see when I'm coaching these individuals, that, hey, if you get results, you can act however you want. That's the messaging. Another good example is bureaucracy. So in this context, bureaucracy is organizations that have a lot of rules and regulations, are often bigger organizations, places like universities, government agencies. So if I'm a bully in a bureaucratic large organization, I can hide in the weeds. It's hard to point it out, versus if I'm in a small company of 15 employees, for example. I can also use the organization's resources to bully. So if we're in bureaucratic organizations, there's likely some sort of horrible performance management system that's lengthy and nobody's really monitoring it because there's so many employees. So I could use that as a bullying tactic to say somebody's a poor performer and they shouldn't get a bonus, because I'm using this bureaucratic performance management document versus a smaller organization. So bureaucratic organizations are another risk factor. So there, again, lots of different things the organization needs to focus on if they're really going to focus on creating an environment that doesn't tolerate this type of behavior. So unfortunately, 75% of people who feel harassed never report that to their employer. And that's the statistic comes from SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They both did their own surveys a couple years apart. They both had over 5,000 respondents in their surveys, and they both found this number. So that's an important, scary number. And I often, when I'm presenting to human resources, which is my main target market and who I'm speaking to conferences, I'll ask, well, how come people don't report it? And everyone goes, retaliation. They're afraid of retaliation. But part two then is why? Why are they afraid of retaliation in your organization? Because if you just say, well, everybody's afraid of retaliation, you're putting it on the target. That's their problem. They're afraid of retaliation. But I think an organization should really be saying, what are we doing or not doing that would cause people to be afraid of retaliation here in this organization? Because we want people to tell us things. So we love to, again, villainize people who engage in bullying. There's lots of references to calling them psychopaths, brutal bosses. Here's a book, Snakes in Suits, When Psychopaths Go to Work. So we're essentially calling them animals and psychopaths and narcissists and all of this stuff. And, this person is seen as frustrating, but the leadership always tends to see them as very valuable. And everyone is running away, right? Including managers, because managers aren't, or leaders aren't willing to speak up. And Lauren, I see your comment, Mr. Burns. Yeah, what's kind of fascinating is, well, just thinking back 15 years ago when I started my company, I would tell people, Civility Partners is going to end workplace bullying. And because people didn't really know what it was 15 years ago, they would kind of joke, oh, what do you take them out back and, punch them, or what, haha, or what does that even mean? What is bullying? And now that's not what I hear. People always say, oh my gosh, that's what you do. I have a story. People always have some bullying scenario to share with me. But I'm just going back to Mr. Burns. It's really interesting that we have all these examples of bullying. Mr. Burns has been around for a long time, long before Civility Partners started. And back then people weren't computing, it was just kind of funny, Mr. Burns. And there's examples of bullies from movies from long ago, from TV shows from long ago. And it's just sort of fascinating to me that only now are we really saying, hey, that we can't have people acting like that. It was very normal. Yeah. Especially in the 90s, we had lots of fun movies about horrible bosses, like what is it, Greco, the Wall Street guy. Demi Moore was in plenty of movies where she was kind of the target of bullying at work and then came out on top in the end. That was kind of her character that she played a lot. So these people who engage in bullying, they can change. If you're at the receiving end of the behavior, it probably feels like they can't, that it does feel like they're a villain and they probably enjoy treating you that way. People at the receiving end of bullying behavior experience anxiety, depression, detachment. They leave, they're at work, but not really present. That's what presenteeism is. Unfortunately, you can develop PTSD if you are bullied at work. So I often say how profound that is, that you could be a soldier at work or a soldier at war or go to work, and you could both develop PTSD symptoms. And unfortunately, there are lots of examples of people committing suicide because they were bullied, and also engaging in violence, showing back up at the workplace to make people pay for the way they were treated. Yeah, Devil Wears Prada is another good example of kind of normalizing that. So obviously, when there's bullying, lots of good things are going down. So these, the arrows should be going the other way. We want safety and self-esteem and loyalty and relationships and communication to be going up and improving, not going down. So what is bullying exactly? It's aggressive communication, angry yelling, sending abusive emails, name calling, getting in people's personal space. It's humiliation, pointing out mistakes in front of others, playing tricks on people, socially isolating them, and then manipulation, giving incomplete information, for example. The one individual I was talking about earlier that would lean over the table, one of the ways that he manipulated was that if you asked him a question and he thought your question was stupid, which he thought lots of people around him were essentially stupid. If you asked him a question and he thought it was stupid, he would get after you. If you didn't ask him a question and you went down the wrong path of your work, then he would also get after you. So you couldn't ask him a question because if you did, you'd get into trouble. But then if you didn't ask him a question because you were afraid to, then you'd end up going down the wrong path with your performance. And so, it was damned if you do, damned if you don't. So the assumption is that these individuals are fully aware of their behavior, they're focused on harm, that if they're, I have this conversation with CEOs all the time. Have you called out their behavior before? No. Why not? Well, I don't want them to quit. They bring high results. Nobody's going to say, hey, if you need to change your behavior, no one's going to say, well, fine, I'm going to go somewhere else where I can be this way. It's not what's going to happen. It's just an irrational fear on the part of CEOs. The reality is they're fully unaware of the impact of their behavior. They often know that people don't really like working with them, and they see it as, well, I'm just trying to get results. They're not aware of the impact they're having. Their intention is really focused on results. It's not intended to harm. If it was, they would be a psychopath, but it's not generally. I have come across a couple of those folks in my life, but they are generally very appalled when they find out how they're impacting others. So for example, this individual I coached, when I talked to him about coaching, he said, well, I've been walking around like an asshole for 3 years and nobody told me. I wish they told me sooner. So he just had no idea. He just thought people didn't like working with him. Another example of this whole thing around intention is this individual. I remember distinctly him saying, well, my boss tells me I'm responsible for 5,000 paychecks. There's no room for errors. So if people made an error or a mistake, he lost it. But it was coming from a place of pressure to make sure everybody got their paychecks. It was ironically coming from a good place. So people bully for 3 reasons. They're focused on, I call it uber competence. They are hyper focused on coming across as the most competent person in the room, in the company. And of course, they lack empathy. If they had empathy, they would know about the impact they have. And so their incompetence gives them anxiety. So what's happening is they feel threatened by incompetence, essentially, or the perception of incompetence. That gives them anxiety, and they defend themselves with fight, right? And then everybody else feels threatened by the individual. They have anxiety, and they're defending themselves by fleeing and avoiding the individual. So what coaching is focused on when I coach these individuals is working through the anxiety. So a lot of my coaching is really just kind of saying, shh, simmer down. It's okay that people make mistakes. Your job is to help them fix the mistake. Your job is to help them learn, use these mistakes as teachable moments, so that's what my coaching is all about, is just helping them work through their anxieties and try to understand what they're so anxious about. I have a cool story. So I'm just finishing up coaching a newscaster, and in the state where he lives, he is the most viewed newscaster. He's created a kind of a show that's edgy. And so he is the #1 watched newscaster in that state. So he believes there's no room for errors, right? There we are around that whole competence thing. His whole reputation is banking on everybody else doing their job essentially perfectly. And as we've been closing out, he was telling me recently that he realized how unhappy he was before we were coaching, because he was so focused on mistakes. He was just kind of constantly on edge around mistakes and so the little things. And then he'd blow up at somebody, and then he wasn't happy because now there's aftermath of the blowups. And he just said, now that I'm less focused on that, I'm not so anxious about it, and I'm learning to just trust people to do their job, I'm a lot happier, and I'm a lot happier at home. And so it was just really neat to hear that he had gone from being unhappy without even realizing it to now, like, now that I'm relaxing around this idea of competence and mistakes, that it's okay. It's okay for people to learn. So when I coach individuals, I follow these 3 steps. So the first step, so if you're a leader or a manager in your organization, and you have anybody who's engaging in any sort of bad behavior, this little script is going to change your life. So you're going to say, I've had some complaints about perceptions. For example, I'm hearing that you can be curt or blunt, and sometimes you snap at people. I'd love to hear your side. What's going on? And then they're going to say, no way, it's not true. They're sensitive. They deserve it. I'm just trying to hold them accountable. So here's the key. You're going to say, I don't know what's happening. I'm not there all the time. The one thing I know, the one thing that we have to fix, though, is that people feel a certain way about the way they're being treated, essentially, right? So we often get really focused in a fact battle with them. You know, someone will say, well, I'm not doing that. I didn't do that. That's not what happened. And you could say, I don't know, but I do know that people perceived the way you were in the meeting yesterday was abrasive. And so we got to try to understand why. So let's talk about that. Why might people feel like you were abrasive? It doesn't matter if you believe you were or not. And so getting away from the facts and getting more focused on perceptions and how people feel about you is, or about this individual, is going to be the key game changer. I also, when I coach individuals, I require a consequence because, as I mentioned, the narrative is often that this person's been acting this way for quite a while. And in fact, they've been getting bonused and promoted and rewarded for the results. And so when they're being referred into coaching by the organization, they're a little lost as to what's wrong. I've been acting this way for a while. What's the problem? So I require a consequence because I need the organization to take a stance. And then from there, we help them understand what's going on. We're going to make them see and make them care, and then we're going to help them. So the 3 questions that I'm focused on in coaching these individuals is, what are the negative perceptions? What's causing them? And what strategies can we develop? So to get to the first question, what are the negative perceptions? I interview 15 people who work with this person. 10 of the names I got from the person I'm coaching, and 5 of the names I get from HR. And then I take all of my interview notes and I move it all into themes, and then I read the document to them. So for example, I just pull it up and I've got this is very real feedback from one of my clients, and I'll read it to them. I'll say, okay, well, here's, the first theme is that you have aggressive body language. And I read the comments of the people they work with. So now it's not HR just saying people feel this way and you need to stop. Now it's the words of the 15 people I interviewed saying this. So now we have the answers to question 1. Now we need to get to the answers of questions 2 and 3. So that's where the coaching comes in. So just to give you an example, this was one of my favorite clients. I was not super successful with him, but he adds some color to my examples, my library of examples. So one of his themes in that document was that he was pretty egotistical and thought very highly of himself. So he was telling me that people don't, on Monday morning meetings, when he starts the meeting off with, how was everyone's weekend? His people don't answer. People don't speak up. So what he's observing is what the people don't tell me what they did over the weekend when I ask. And then I said, well, why? And he says, well, they're ashamed of their activities. They know that they can't compete with me. And so then it's like, okay, interesting. That sounds a little like that ego topic we talked about. Do you think that that's one of the reasons your theme is egotistical? And how can you eliminate this perception that you're egotistical? I guess I need to be more humble. So we need to switch up how we're handling those morning meetings and how we're judging people and their weekend activities. So just to give you an example of a person I coached, Mercedes, this was some of her feedback in that first round of interviews. And then after about 4 months of coaching, I re-interview everyone. And this was her feedback after. She's actually one of my star students. She really made a complete 180. So it does work. These individuals can change. I'm going to spend my last 4 minutes talking about individual allyship. So things that you can do to help each other or help yourself when you are seeing bad behavior at work. So there's a really great 4-step process. It's not my process. It's well researched in the field of communication, and it's a great 4 steps to assertiveness. So let me give you an example. You might say, I understand that we're all colleagues and it's super easy to get caught up in each other's lives. Hey, I've worked with Frank for 18 years. But I do hear some gossiping going around lately. And I worry that if we let that go on, we'll start to create a culture accepting of this behavior. And I think it could be harmful. When I hear gossip, I usually just tell people it's not my business. Maybe we could all try to put a stop to gossip when we hear it. So you validate the individual. That's how you're going to empathize with them. We need empathy to open our ears up to solutions. So you're going to create empathy by validating them. You don't have to validate their behavior, but validate them. And then state the problem, provide the impact, because they probably aren't thinking about the impact, and then give them a solution. So this is a great way for you to put a stop to bad behavior or toxic behavior before it gets too far, before it escalates from something like gossip up to bullying. I also will offer you, I'll show my email in a moment. I have a list of 16 scripts essentially that you could choose from. So my suggestion is to read the 16 scripts and then, pick 1 or 2 of them. And then you have those in your back pocket. So you have that available to pull out anytime. So one of the scripts on that 16 options is to ask a question. And that's kind of my main go-to one. And I might just say, I'm curious why you said that. And that often causes people to go, oh, actually, I'm not sure why I said that. Let me think about it. So it kind of puts them in their place a little bit, gets them thinking about why they said or did something just by asking, hey, I'm curious about why you said that or why you did that. So if you want to email me, I'm happy to send you a few things. One is the 16 scripts. I have an ebook if you're interested to learn more about people who bully and why they bully and how to coach them into change. And if you need a resource to make a business case for your leadership team for addressing any sort of toxic behavior in your workplace, my homepage has a culture calculator, and it will help you say this is expensive and here's why. So with that, we have a minute or 2 for questions if anybody has any other additional questions. And thank you for hearing me out this morning.